If you're considering a Mark 7 Evolution 10-station progressive reloading press, you're probably wondering, what about the caliber changes? What parts are involved? What processes are necessary? How difficult is it? And how long is it going to take me? In this video, we're going to answer all of those questions. Gavin here from UltimateReloader.com. This is the Mark 7 Evolution, and if you're interested in this amazing 10-station progressive reloading press, you're going to want to first check out my unboxing, overview, setup, and loading 9mm video. In this video, we're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to take a look at what it takes to convert this press over, to switch it over to load 223 or 556. The setup is the same. And what I've got here are all of the parts and components that you'd typically buy for an ultra smooth caliber changeover. You can do it without all of these parts, for example, without a dedicated powder measure, but you're going to need some extra parts and you're going to have to switch that over. So what we've got here first, I'm just going to go from this side over to this side, is a case feed plate. This is the same as the Hornady Lock and Load AP press, and this is for small rifle. So let's get that out of the box. Take a look at what that looks like. These are actually also compatible with Dillon presses. So this is going to drop in. We're going to adjust these screws to give it the appropriate amount of clutching that will allow it to rotate if things get bound up. That's simple and straightforward. Here we've got the box that has the tool head assembly. This is where you're going to screw in all of the dies. Let's get a good look at that. Okay. There we go. It's billet aluminum. Looks like that's all there is in that particular box. Okay, we've got a dedicated rifle powder measure. Take a look what this looks like. Everything comes packed really nicely with bubble wrap to protect all of the vital components and pieces. Okay. Look at that. I just love the quality of these Mark 7 components and pieces. This will just slide right off. Interesting thing about these powder measures, they've got these screens built in, and that's so that if you happen to have a torn piece of lid gasket from the seal on a brand new jug of powder, it falls in there, it's not going to go down through the powder measure. That could actually cause a major problem. If you've got shell casings floating around, whatever it is, that's going to prevent any debris from getting into the hopper, but it's going to allow the powder to pass through. I did a setup on the powder measure in the 9mm video. You're going to want to check that out if you haven't already seen that one. Okay, so that's the powder measure. And here we've got the other caliber conversion parts. So let me get that box out of the way. This is exactly how it's going to come to you from Mark 7 if you were to order these bits. Very carefully using the knife because I don't want to scratch the parts. Okay, case inserter. This is going to be our shell plate. Look at that. 10 stations. Still getting my head used to that. Love it. Talk about flexibility. There's a station for everything and everything in its station. With my setup here, I'm using all 10 stations, for example. I went through a thought exercise a while back of what if I separated the process down into all of the different processes and had a station for each, and it looked something like that. Okay, and the adapter for the case feed. So these are the components, all of the parts and pieces for an ideal caliber changeover. We've also got the stand here where we're going to be able to set the tool head and the main components and pieces. That way on your shelf, if you have a bunch of different calibers that you're switching between, everything can be just grabbed in one unit and then do all your caliber changeover and set it back. This is the wrench that we're going to use that came with the press for the nut that holds the tool head down. Okay, I'm going to remove some of the components and take some of the pieces apart, and then we'll perform the caliber changeover. So I just got the caliber changeover teardown steps done, and I just had a couple good conversations with Mark 7 to get all of the specifics, all of the tips and tricks down for this caliber changeover process on the Evolution. But before we jump into those steps, I did want to review a couple things. First, the parts that you may or may not need for a caliber changeover include the case feed plate for the case feed assembly. If you're going from small pistol to small pistol of a different variety that uses the same case feed plate, or large rifle to large rifle, and so on and so forth, you may or may not need that, so you have to check. There's the case feed adapter. This is where the drop tube drops cases down and they are picked up and inserted into the shell plate by the case feed ram. Turns out in this particular case, this is a number 1 for 223. 9mm also uses a number 1. So in this particular case, I could have ordered parts separately and not gotten the complete caliber changeover kit and saved a few bucks that way. We've got the shell plate itself. And again, if you're going from one 308 case rim cartridge to another, or from 40 to 10, for instance, on the pistol side, you're not going to need a new shell plate. A powder measure. This could also optionally be needed. I've got one powder measure that came with the press setup for 9mm. I've got another dedicated powder measure here that's going to be used for 223, and I could also set up for other rifle cartridges. There's a different drop tube in there and other parts as well. And then there's also the tool head itself. And you can reuse tool heads if you're going to do 2 different operations for, say, the same cartridge. You could completely remove the dies and only have one tool head, but you're likely going to want to have at least one tool head per cartridge. We're going to do 223, and later I'll do case prep with it. I might use the same tool head for both, since a lot of the die stations would be the same. For instance, the hold down station over priming, for instance, and over swaging. So those are some of the considerations. These are the parts and pieces. If you click on that first link in the video description, I'll have more information, kind of a breakdown of what's needed for each of the different cartridges that are supported on the Evolution and all the parts that are necessary. And then the tools part. This is kind of interesting. It's all Allen keys that you're going to use. I have a couple different Bondus kits. The screwdriver type with ball end, love these. They get into some of the tricky places. For instance, the screws here on the priming column, and if you've got the tool head in place, it helps to get into those tight spaces. And then I also have the Bondus T-handle set. These float all over the place, and I use them all over the shop. Okay, now let's get into the actual caliber changeover process. So I'm going to start with the first half of the process, which is sort of the tear down steps, and we're going to start up high on the press and work our way down. I'm using the Mr. Bullet feed system for both pistol and rifle. That's kind of the standard kit that the Mark 7 system is engineered around. And what you can do is empty the bullet feed drop tube by just pushing up on the collar that is raised when a bullet is dropped onto the case. If you repeatedly tap it, you can just cup your hand, all the bullets will drop into it. Dump it into the collator bowl, loosen the clamps that hold the collator bowl to the case feed bowl, and then dump those bullets into your box. Now it's time to empty the case feeder. And if you have quick release cord routing, this entire case feed bowl can lift right off the top. You can dump all of the cases into your case bin and then remove the case feed plate. Now, I didn't think ahead in that way, so I had to scoop out the cases from the case feed bowl and then pull the case feed plate. Either way, it's only going to take you a minute or two. Then we're going to remove and empty the powder measure. Now this is where the Mark 7 system is real nice. There's one small Allen set screw here. If you back that out, you can slip the entire upper portion of the powder measure up off of the powder feed die and dump it into your powder canister. Then we're going to empty the priming system, and you can get the column of primers removed by removing 3 different Allen screws and then carefully sliding the entire primer column off of the press frame and then letting go of the primers into whatever container you're using to keep your primers for a particular type in storage. If we were going to be changing primer sizes, which I'm not here, I'm moving from small pistol primers to small rifle primers, same dimensions, we would have a couple more parts to remove, the punch and then the slider, things like that. We've got a tube inside the explosion shield here, the drop tube that we would need to change as well. Takes just a few additional minutes. Now we're going to remove the entire tool head assembly. There's still the case feed tube to remove. It slips into the case feed motorized bowl and it slips into the case feed adapter. We've got the tool head retention nut, this huge nut up here. There's a large washer. We're going to loosen that, holding on to the press handle while we loosen it. When it completely separates from the ram, we're going to gently lower down the handle and slide the entire tool head up and off. There are a couple parts that we're going to reuse on the tool head that we're going to reinstall later. That would include this return spring, the return spring guide rod and mount. 2 Allen screws are removed and that pulls right off the tool head we're removing. Now it's time to take a look at your reference documentation to see if the case feed ram, the inserter, needs to be swapped out. As I mentioned previously, I've got a number 1 for 9mm and I've got a number 1 for 223. I now have an extra one because I got the complete caliber changeover kit. I don't need to worry about this, but I took it apart to show you what it's going to take. 2 Allen screws, remove the entire assembly from the press. 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom allows you to split this clamshell essentially, remove the inserter ram and replace it with the new caliber that you're using the case inserter for. Reassemble the clamshell and then bolt it back to the press. Now it's time to remove the case retention spring, the shell plate retention nut, and the shell plate itself. There's a couple clamps, one on either side of the press frame, that hold the shell plate retention spring in place. 2 small Allen screws on either side. You remove the clamps and remove the spring. Then there's set screws that hold the shell plate retention nut in place. You can see them along the circumference here. I'm going to take an Allen key, crack those, loosen them just a little bit, loosen that nut, work it all the way off, lift it off the press. You can then lift the shell plate off, clean it carefully, and lay everything out so that you're ready for reassembly. And here we can see the press after it has been reassembled with the components installed for 223/556 loading. And the reassembly process is pretty much the inverse of the removal. So I'll cover this at a high level. Most of the details are approximately the same. The first thing I did was to clean the subplate below where the shell plate spins. I put a light coat of grease down both on the subplate and on the back of the number 4 shell plate. Number 1 shell plate with this system for 9mm, number 4 shell plate for 223/556 or cartridges that have that overall case length and case rim. I got the shell plate dropped on, and then there is the shell plate nut. This is this giant nut, and what you want to do is screw that down until it's tight and then loosen it 1/8 of a turn. This is octagonal. There's 8 flats on the nut, so what I did was to tighten it down and then put my finger at the next flat over, loosen it 1 flat worth, and then tighten the screws down. I had to experiment a little bit with the set screw torque to make sure that it wasn't clamped down too hard, but that it wasn't going to rotate in operation. So if you stick an Allen key in the set screw, you can get a little bit more leverage to figure out how that's going to look. Then I took the priming ram cassette and put that back together. There's a spring, there's the ram, and then there's the 2 halves. As I mentioned in the teardown, I didn't actually have to do that because we're going from 9mm, which is used as a number 1 case inserter, to 223, which also uses the number 1 case inserter. But I did want to show that because if you're going from one cartridge to another, the diameter varies enough between the two, then you're going to have to split that assembly. With the shell plate down, I then installed the circumferential retention spring. Now I put a little bit of a crimp mark on my other one in my previous setups and experimentation. So I actually replaced the spring. The press comes with a handful of springs, and there's 2 clamps, one on either end. The clamps sit down on top of the shell plate and have a fairly close fit in terms of where they sit. And then there's little clamp assemblies for the actual spring itself. So I ran that through, clamped it on the right-hand side first, pulled it taut, trimmed it to length, and then clamped that back down. Now that we have the circumferential spring in and the shell plate nut, we can actually attach the case inserter assembly, that whole clamshell unit, to the press. There's 2 Allen screws that go in from the bottom. You can feel it kind of set in place. Lock those down, and then we're good to go. At this point, I took a look at the tool head itself. As I mentioned in the teardown, there's this guide rod, bracket, and spring. We're going to reuse all of those components, bolts right onto the side of the tool head. The tool head slips on. You're going to want to provide a little bit of lubrication on this guide rod here, and then push the tool head all the way down to the bottom, making sure it doesn't bind. This is an important step. Then comes the retention nut that clamps the tool head to the ram itself. And with the tool head in the down position, we're going to screw that all the way in and then tighten it. Then we can cycle the press a couple times to ensure that everything is lined up properly. If it isn't, stop and investigate. There's probably a simple solution. With the tool head installed, there's just a couple more things to do. There's the case feed adapter. This looks like it's a number 5. There's a couple screws. One is a pivot screw, the one in the back, and then the other is a retention screw. It swings into place, and then the retention screw is torqued down. Then we can install the drop tube itself, which has a spring center section. It's got an aluminum adapter, and then it's got the window, which is acrylic plastic that presses right down into the case feed adapter, and then the other aluminum end plugs up into the case feed bowl. Case feed system is now ready. I dropped in the small rifle case feed plate when I took out the 9mm, which is the small pistol case feed plate. Now we can screw down the powder measure, and what I did was I put a case, a 5.56 case, in station number 6. That's where our powder measure goes by default, and lowered the tool head, screwed the powder measure down until it was all the way at the top of its rotational stroke when the tool head was all the way down at the bottom. Tightened the lock nut, good to go. So right now we have the press. Basically the core press setup is complete, and what I'll cover next is installing our dies, filling our components, and we'll do a simple 223 loading scenario. So before we set up dies, I just wanted to make quick mention of how self-contained all of the 9mm gear is now. The Mark 7 caliber changeover rack will accommodate the tool head, which includes, of course, the powder measure. It's got a slot for the shell plate, and it's got pockets cut out for the case inserter ram if you need to swap that out and have extras of that, and also the case feed adapter. So we can set that up on the shelf. I've got my Mr. Bullet Feeder case feed bowl here, and then the case feed plate for the case feeder. A very compact collection of gear that should take not a whole lot of time, probably about 20 to 30 minutes total to get a caliber changeover sequence completed, and then also to validate the ammo. Let's also talk about components. For this loading session, we're going to go with a classic AR-15 223 5.56 load. This is actually Starline 5.56 brass. The only difference between it and Starline 223 brass is an extra heat treat between 2 of the stages. We've got 55 grain Mid-South shooter supply, Varmint Nightmare bullets, FMJ. Again, right in the sweet spot of the weight range for this particular cartridge for the AR platform. This is going to be kind of run and gun and training ammo, so we don't have any particular hunting considerations here. We're using Hodgdon CFE 223. This is a flattened ball powder. Works really good through just about any powder measure. It's going to measure very consistently and accurately, and it also has the copper fouling eraser built in, so that's going to prevent copper buildup if we're shooting a whole bunch of rounds through our AR-15, which we should be when we're in a training scenario, that's going to work out really good. And then we've got Federal. This is number 205. It's their standard small rifle primer. And then I'm using an interesting assortment of dies here. For the sizer, I've got a standard Redding 223 sizer die, and it's only expanding the case neck with the expander ball. We're not doing sizing because we have brand new brass here. I always like to run at least an expander ball, if not a mandrel, through the neck of rifle brass before I load it in its virgin state, because that's going to help to set appropriate neck tension and not have too much neck tension. Then over the priming stage, I'm using a Redding 30-06 40-degree improved shoulder sizing die with the expander ball and decapping pin removed, and we're using that specifically as an oversized die just to press down on the shell plate when the priming is happening. So we're using that as a hold down die. And then for my Hornady 223 die setup, we've got their bullet seating die with the seating plug removed and replaced with the micrometer seating stem. I'm a huge fan of using micrometers for seating dies because it just makes setting bullet depth that much easier. So let's take a look at the die setup process and the validation of all of our component setups. So let's go over die stations and die setups. We've got 10 stations here. Station number 1 is for case insertion. Station number 2 is for sizing and depriming. And as I mentioned previously, here we've got brand new brass, and because of that, we're not full length sizing. We're just running that expander ball through the case neck. I've still got the decapping pin in there. If somehow a piece of brass got in with the primer, we would deprime that as well. So I lowered the tool head, ran the die down until it contacted the shell plate, backed it out a couple turns, and locked the nut. Station number 3 would be where swaging happens. I'll cover that in a future video like I did for 9mm. Station number 4 is priming. So we've got the primer depth adjustment, and we got to set that when we take a new tool head and get it ready for use. And then I've also got a hold down die here that we're using to keep the shell plate down when the primer punch is pushing up. So my first thing was to lower the tool head, run this in until it was snug up the lock nut, and then insert a piece of primed brass. Now this didn't have powder in it, didn't have a bullet inserted. So this was just to get a feel for where the primer should be. Ran the primer depth adjustment rod down until I felt resistance. This is going to be something you're going to have to experiment with a little bit. And when I was done, I had a setup that wasn't going to crush the primer, but was going to seat it to the appropriate depth and was working smoothly. If we pull up the die station utilization diagram, we can see that station number 5 is set aside for case mouth expansion. That's typically a pistol operation, so we won't be using that die station here. Station number 6 is dedicated for the powder measure. Got that down to the appropriate depth, so it's got the drum at full swing when the tool head is in its bottom position. Loosen the lock nut and work the metering insert screw until we've got the appropriate powder charge. Check it, double check it, triple check it, and then good. Okay, stations number 7 and 8 are going to be a magnetic powder check die from Double Alpha in the next video, and then also in the next video we're going to look at the Mr. Bullet feeder for rifle. So I don't suggest running a press like this without the powder check. We're just running it here as kind of a preliminary setup in anticipation of having these 2 stations filled. Station number 9 is for bullet seat. And again, with the tool head in its down position, we ran that down on a loaded cartridge. Here I'm using PMC, factory ammunition, just as a rough datum point. And when it hit the shoulder, snug the die down, and then I had backed off the seating plug. I then ran it down until it contacted, ran one of my test cartridges through that we had primed and that we had charged. We expanded the case mouth on and then dialed in the seating depth with the micrometer seating plug. And that's how I like to run these dies, is with micrometers. It always makes setting that depth easier. Station number 10 would be for crimp. You know, with rifle cartridges, that's a personal thing. If we wanted maximum functioning in an AR-15, we could put a crimp on. I don't really see the need for that. So I've also got that station empty as well. So let's now test the setup. So for a test, we're gonna run one shell casing through and it's gonna come out a loaded cartridge. So for simplicity, I haven't filled the case feed bowl yet. I'm just gonna drop one down the drop tube there. It's gonna insert it. We're gonna go ahead and run our expander ball through. Swaging, which is swaging nothing. Priming, empty station. We're gonna charge the case with powder. Now I'm gonna just take a quick visual before I put that bullet on. Yep, absolutely. We're good. The good thing about the circumferential spring is that it makes it easy to remove cartridges from particular stations and seat the bullet. We're gonna wanna double check our bullet seat depth here. I'm at 2.236, that's right in there where I set it. Now we're ready for full progressive loading. So now all of our components are ready to go. I previously had loaded primers and powder. I just dumped a bunch of 5.56 Starline new cases in the case feed bowl. I had to tweak the clutch screws on the feed plate, which is typical. Now it's got enough torque to feed those cases, but it's also got a safety factor built in as well if things get stuck. We loaded the drop tube, and at this point, we should be ready to pull the handle and watch things happen. Again, I'm gonna get ready with the new rhythm for this particular loading session. Okay, we should start seeing powder go. Yep. Looks like things are working well so far. And ready for bullets. It's got kind of an interesting feel as the expander ball goes down through the case neck. I just have to be ready for that. Mission accomplished. For this stage of the caliber changeover, we're up and running, we validated our setup, and we are ready now to go on to the next step, which is going to be to add that magnetic powder check die and the entire Mr. Bullet Feeder bullet feed system. That's really how we want to load ammo for this particular scenario. We don't want to be without a powder check, and I don't want to be placing bullets on the case. So make sure you're subscribed with notifications because you're going to want to check out that video. I hope this video was helpful to those of you that either have an Evolution or are looking at getting one. This caliber changeover process is straightforward, but this is a complicated 10-station machine. So there's a few things that you just have to bear in mind, and I hope that it helped you to see the process end to end. If so, please give this video a thumbs up. And what do you think? What do you think of this caliber changeover process, the Evolution press, the Revolution? Please drop a comment and we'll start a Mark 7 discussion. Now, also don't forget, I've got Ultimate Reloader shirts at the Ultimate Reloader store. I've got a link to a more detailed article. That's going to be that first link in the video description, and on Patreon. All those links are right down there in the video description. Thanks for watching. Until next time, happy shooting and happy reloading.